Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to go into some deep lore. You see, we're going to talk about chaos today, as when most people think about chaos, they think about the warriors of chaos. You know, the Northmen who are clad in blessed armor, here to reap destruction. Or the chaos demons, the extensions of the very chaos gods themselves. The Beastmen, the kind of forgotten children of chaos. Not so much like the Fimir, but the Beastmen don't really get as much attention as they really do deserve. And finally the Norscans. Now, not all Norscans worship the Chaos Gods, but a large majority of the tribes do, and most people now refer to pretty much most of the Northmen as Norscans, which couldn't be further from the truth, as there are a lot of Northmen which are very different, based on culture, religion, or pretty much anything. Yes, they all kind of fall under the Chaos umbrella, but it's a massive shame when people think of Norscans, they think that they are all the Northmen. So today I want to talk about some Chaos factions which are kind of lesser known throughout the Warhammer Fantasy universe. These are factions that might have not gotten that much attention during Warhammer Fantasy, no army list, no miniatures, or some miniatures but very, very little. So yeah, let's just get started and talk. So we're going to start off with the more well-known one, which are the Kurgans. Many of you have heard the name Kurgan before, including some of the tribes such as the Kazakhs, the Kul, the Dolgan. This is because a lot of rather famous Kurgans did exist in Warhammer Fantasy lore, Crom the Conqueror, Tamukan, and even the 12th ever-chosen Asavar Kul, one of the most dastardly and evil characters ever existing in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. Now, the Kurgans don't really have an empire so much as they are a nomadic people split into many tribes that often do fight amongst each other. What we do know is that the Kurgans do actually control a very large portion of the world, that being the eastern steppes right above Grand Cathay. Warhammer 3 presents that to be more like Chaos Wastes, when in reality it should be grassland. Kurgan threats have been felt throughout much of the known world. We've seen Kurgan invasions of, say, for example, the Border Princes or even the Empire, and something which might be quite interesting to note, there is a Kurgan tribe in the Old World itself, that of the Dolgans that live in Kislev. There's not many of them, but they do live there, and yes, they do worship chaotic creatures. Society-wise, the Kurgans are actually quite interesting. As expected, shamans are actually very common throughout the Norscan tribes, unless one of them is to dedicate to the blood god, because they will actively kill the sorcerers, but they act as seers, not only spellcasters, or even tribal diplomats, even though that diplomacy for the Kurgans is very basic at best. Like I said, the Kurgans are a nomadic people, meaning that they will move around constantly. The steppes often provide different types of resources, and well, they just have to move to around different hunting grounds. However, it has been known for Kurgans to take over great cities, fortresses, castles, anything of the like, and settle for a while at the very least. But these fortifications aren't built by the Kurgans themselves, these are taken from anyone else by force. And women within the Kurgan society are actually quite interesting. You see, they don't marry. Kurgans don't actually marry, they are just there to breed. However, a woman can receive a lot of respect and admiration from her tribe if she gives birth to a mighty warrior. However, if they give birth to weaker warriors, they're often shunned. But the ones that give birth to strong men receive praise like any other, like if they were a shaman, for example, as they are making sure the lineage of their tribe continues for days to come. Now, like I said earlier, we know of very famous Kurgans. Crom the Conqueror, by the 8th edition timeline, is the leader of the Kul tribe, and for a while even thought that he was the next Everchosen after Asavar Kul. This was proven false when Archaon the Everchosen showed up and beat him into submission. Crom, rather than continuing to fight, actually submitted to Archaon, realizing his true power, and since then became the Herald of the Everchosen. Tamukan is one of 4 great sons of the Great Kurgan. Unfortunately, we've not heard of the other 3, but Tamukan himself is devoted to Nurgle and led a mighty army combined of warriors of chaos of different gods, beastmen, and even monsters and chaos dwarves into an invasion of the Empire, and almost succeeded in and completely destroying Wissenland. Had he not been stopped in the Battle of Null, he would have probably even destroyed the whole empire, turning the once proud nation into a possibly Nurgle-infested territory. Naturally, we're not going over every known Kurgan, but the last that we will talk about is Asavar Kul, the 12th ever chosen of Chaos, and the antagonist for the whole Old World setting. A chaotic warrior who managed to unite the tribes fairly quickly and united Chaos under one banner in an effort to destroy the Warhammer world and bring about the end times. Obviously, this didn't happen as he was later defeated during the Great War against Chaos, but it's said that even 200 years later, the world still feels the effect of Asavar Kul's carnage. And I believe now the best way to actually get a little bit more context regarding the Kurgans as a whole is by reading over their entry into the Liber Chaotica. So this is a book which went into a lot of detail regarding Chaos back in the day. I believe it did get a reprint at some point, but there's been some drama recently for further reprints. Regardless, when it comes to the Kurgan entry, it's put into the perspective of a book known as The Peoples of the World by a Bretonnian scholar. It's not very long, so let's read over it. The nation of the Kurgans surpass all other barbarians in their wildness of life, though they do just bear the likeness of men. Of a very ugly pattern, they are so little advanced in civilization that they make no use of fire, nor any kind of relish, in the preparation of their food, but feed upon the roots which they find in the fields, and half-raw flesh of any sort of animal. I say half-raw because they give it a kind of cooking by placing it between their own thighs and the backs of their horses. They fight in no regular order of battle, but by being extremely swift and sudden in their movements. They disperse and then rapidly come together in loose array. They spread havoc over the vast plains, and flying over the ramparts, they pillage the camp of their enemy almost before he has become aware of their approach. They are the most terrible of warriors, for when in close combat with swords and flails, they fight without regard to their own safety, and while their enemy is intent upon parrying the thrust of the swords, they will entangle them with their chains so that he loses all power of walking or riding. So we can tell here that they focus very heavily on skirmish combat, and I think that's something which is not really heard too much when it comes to the Chaos factions. Yes, you get that with the Sineshi faction and obviously the Beastmen, but their type of skirmish is focused around, tactics, using allures or using big monsters and stuff, whereas the Kurgans themselves are so violent, they will happily throw themselves into positions where they might get killed, but it's going to be a glorious and bloody death. Anyways, now we can actually get into the actual meat and potatoes of all this, so let's talk about it, right? The Kurgan are a people of mystery and fear, a savage race that rides such fleet steeds as to allow them to fly across the land as fast as birds. Their domains lie far from our borders, and yet their speed of movement is such that no one can be sure where or when their next attack shall fall. Those few cartographers who recognize the Kurgan's existence do consign them to a far corner of the map, but in fact their territory far outstrips that of any other human realm. Indeed, all the land that we call our own up to the World's Edge Mountains would fit many times within the area they control. The eastern steppes are massive plains with seemingly endless stretches of dry, treeless grassland, which lie beyond the great mountain range known as the Mountains of Morn. They are bordered by the freezing waste to the north, by a great desert to the south, and by the mighty lands of Cathay far to the east. Over this vast territory, there are many tribes, both of humans and of other races. But of the northern areas that lie within the Umbra, the Kurgan are undisputed masters. In truth, however, not even this expanse gives proper extent to their domain, for the Kurgan recognize no borders or boundaries, except perhaps for that ultimate frontier at the north. No obstacle can stop them. Their driven mounts carry them like the wind over high mountains, great deserts, and gushing rivers. They travel where they will, and there are a few, indeed, who dare oppose them. They travel with their entire families, so that is literally the case for many of them to be born in the saddle. Most of these show some taint of chaos upon them, whether it be benign or otherwise, and these marks are flaunted and displayed to show the interest the Lords of Darkness have already shown in them. Many of them go further and try to make their children even more grotesque by binding their skulls while young so that their heads can grow in the long and thin manner so distinctive of their people. Though we may write the names of certain tribes upon a map, this will only give the narrowest indication of their true extent and location, for in the vastness of the steppe there are no confinements, and far greater reliance is placed upon the kin band that the horsemen ride with rather than in the greater tribal name. To an extent, a Kurgan's tribe is those people with whom he travels, no matter their origins, and his property is what he carries with him, and his land is wherever he finds himself. The Kurgans almost invariably travel on horseback with some wagons to carry tents and altars, others without. There are few groups who do not ride, who choose to either wander on foot, possibly because they have lost their mounts through some ailment or accident, or have settled permanently in some forsaken spot. Why would they choose to completely alter their way of life in such a manner is unknown. Perhaps there is something of significance to the site. It's not completely unheard of for a tribe to seize and settle the land it has attacked, and then attempt to defend it while they wrest riches from the earth. Most, though, are almost constantly on the move, either along old age routes between summer and the winterlands, or seemingly at random across the steppe. It is this fluidity that allows them the greatest favor when the shadow creeps out and the dark legions march forth. It is the Kurgan that are most willing and able to join these cursed crusades, for they are able to bring to bear each and every one of their race. For them, there is nothing but advantage in attaching themselves to a larger horde, for they may ride ahead as scouts and take the easiest of the plunder, and when the horde is inevitably reversed or gainstayed, they may always escape the forces of retribution that move against them. In this way, the tribes of the horsemen may follow these hordes and then find themselves far from where they began when eventually they strike out on their own. Thus, they may be found all around the known world. These ravagers lie not contained in the distant lands to be dealt with by stranger folk, hardier than us. Rather, they may come to any town, any door, even while the blinkered folk slumber in their false security. No border, no castle, no country can be a defense against the horsemen of the Shadowlands, for they care for none of them. They move at will across plains and hills and rivers. No barrier can withstand them, nor no levied troop can restrain them, for our armies are snails and slugs that must drag themselves forward, and may fight only where its foe proves willing. The horsemen have no honor, no courage. They will never meet our forces straight on in decisive battle, but flee when confronted by men of metal, and only turn to strike and slaughter against the weak, the innocent, and the ill-prepared. And when they do so, it is without any mercy of human compassion, as Marcia Nasius recorded of the destruction of a city in the Border Princes. There was so much killing and bloodletting that no one could number the dead. The Kurgans pillaged the temples and the shrines, and slew the priests and virgins. They so devastated this land that it will never rise again and be as it was before. Even years later, when we passed through there again, we had to camp outside the city on the river, for the banks were covered with human bones, and the stench of death was so great that no one could enter the city. Our generals bluster and berate, and do denounce this, their craven foe, but in truth, they do as much, for in fact they can do little else. As Count Theo of Stirland lamented, a soldier's great enemies are deprivation and extortion. For him to fight and kill on a single day is nothing to the path of suffering. He first has to endure. Before even courage, the first qualification for a soldier is for endurance to hardship, poverty and want, and they live at peace harder than we live at war. What chance did we even have? The horsemen will never fight until they will it, nor will they have a home except that carried on their horses' backs, so they have no realm to threaten in return. It is true, when gorged with plunder and with death, that they may return to their spawning lands across the world's edge, to count their loot and praise their gods. But how to take the fight to these vast plains? What defense do they need but their eyes in their heads to see danger approach? And when the foe had vanished from our sight, what then? Do we burn the grass? Plunder the streams? Demolish the hills? for there is precious little more than that. Thus our generals bluster, for that is all they can do, while these cursed enemies do raid and burn and keep us in terror inviolate. Their brigand bands do infest our lands as surely as the worms infesting a rotting corpse, roving cancers that bleed the lifeblood of those who least expect it. This then is our current state, with as many of our foe within our borders as without, and our only defense to pile our soft bellies upon their swords. So you can see here why I really like the Kurgans, right? They are such a massive threat because they own no territories. They're able to move around and become a threat without having to defend anything else. And we've seen it from characters that have been introduced, that they perhaps are one of the biggest assets that the Chaos Gods do have, as they will happily do anything that the gods need, especially seeing as when an Everchosen is spawned and creates a horde, they will join. I absolutely love the Kurgans and they definitely need more attention. I honestly think that we will see more Kurgan stuff when it comes to Warhammer the Old World, as there is going to be a heavy Kurgan focus, and this is only one of the missing tribes. The next we shall speak about is another nomadic people known as the Hung. Many people in the Old World will think of them to be very similar to that of the Kurgan, and they have some similarities, but they are not the same people. The Hung are found all throughout the northern territories. These are the northern wastes, the stepplands themselves, and sometimes very far in the western portions of the world near where the Dark Elves are. We'll talk about that mixture a little bit later. But what one thing can be known is that a lot of the tribes of the Hung actually have very Cathayan names. So there is the Yin tribe, the Chiang tribe, the Wei-Tu tribe, Manchu. Many people actually believe that these might have been people who originally lived in the lands of Cathay, but fought against the Dragon Emperor and the other Cathayans as they fell to the influence of the dragons. This is why, for example, if you look towards Warhammer 3, you might even see a faction known as the Dreaded Woe, which is actually a Hung tribe. We don't know how many of these Hung warriors actually dwell within the lands of Grand Cathay, but it can be assumed, since Grand Cathay is so large, that many Hung do still live within those areas, especially in regions which might not be policed as much by the dragon-blooded Shugengan. This is a tribe of men which are known to be very treacherous and deceitful, and they're not very trusted. So it's actually quite interesting, because they don't really fall under the sway of, say, for example, Tzeentch, which you would expect, and each of the tribes will actually just fall into a random Chaos God, right? So you will get Khornate Hung, which are still treacherous and deceitful. They don't care about politics, they don't care about deals, they just want to cause havoc, essentially. And it might be interesting to note that when Morathi was actually forming a new cult of pleasure, essentially mixing up Dark Elves with Warriors of Chaos, the warriors that actually fought under her banner were the Hung. Which, yes, I totally get that Morathi wants to be around a lot of Hung men, but yeah, it's not actually just generic Norscans as many people thought. It was the Hung themselves that filled in a lot of that portion of the cult of Slaanesh. What's curious is that we know pretty much nothing about any Hung of fame, in all honesty, which could be a point of just, you know, eventually as a certain amount of time has passed, another tribesman will kill the leader and take over, and so on and so forth until the end of time, or that tribe is no more. Put it this way, the Chaos Dwarves will trade with the Hung, but even the Chaos Dwarves, deceitful as they are, know not to trust the word of a Hung and not to turn their back to them, because they will get slaughtered. Again, let's read another excerpt from The Peoples of the World by the same Bretonnian scholar, as all this stuff is really good context for this faction, essentially. The people of the Hung, who dwell beyond the far plains over the world's edge mountains, are quite abnormally savage. From the moment of birth, they make deep gashes into the children's cheeks, so that when in due course hair appears, its growth is checked by the wrinkled scars, giving them the unlovingly appearance of beardless eunuchs. They have squat bodies, strong limbs, and thick necks, and are so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be two-legged animals, or the crudely carved gargoyles which the superstitious do desecrate our temples. They have no land, no home, and no law, or settled manner of life, but wander as vagabonds in the wagons in which they live. In these, their wives weave their filthy clothing, mate with their husbands, and give birth to their unlovingly offspring. No one, if asked, can tell where he comes from, having been conceived in one place, born somewhere else, and reared even further off. Far from the old world are the marauding hunters of the Hung, a people so numerous that they stretch across the continents of our world, and are so fearsome that they hold entire realms of men and other races in a grip of terror. Further even than the plains of the Kurgan lie the lands of the Hung. They intermingle with those of the Kurgan in the west, and are removed from Cathay to the south by a great desert that covers much of the border. However, through the wastes, their tribes stretch further across the land bridge that connects the eastern realms to the New World in the west, where they stretch down the broken lands, and across the wasteland bordered by the watchtowers of the Ulthuan renegades. There their tribes once again cross with those of the Kurgan, so between them they may be considered circumscribed the entirety of the infernal gates. Like the Kurgans, the Hung are a roving people, and thus their tribal boundaries cannot be marked by a simple frontier on a map. While they pay more regard to their greater tribe over and above their itinerant kin, these tribes hold no compunction about merging with others to form great alliances, or devolving and reforming as the winds of circumstance change. This ever-shifting loyalty does lead to them to consider as irrelevant bonds and bargains are made with other races. They feel no dishonor in breaking these pacts, or indeed in killing the other parties, and have so gained a reputation for being sly, deceitful, and treacherous. Indeed, the Cathayans use the phrase "word of a Hung" to denote a worthless promise. The Hung live in the saddle. The only structures they inhabit are woolen tents they carry, with which they make their encampments. Obscure legends speak of Hung cities hidden somewhere in the steppes or in the monuments to the north. These places are supposedly great centers for their worship, and guard the fabulous treasures the Hung have plundered and stolen over the centuries. More than one treasure seeker has departed from Cathay and the Empire in order to find these hidden cities, and they have never returned. I believe these stories of great cities to be ridiculous, for the Hung pride themselves on their independent, wandering lifestyle that they believe makes them superior to all sedentary races. If such stories have any basis in fact, as well as they may not, then it is from the lavish encampments of their largest tribes. There the spoils of their raiding, such as silk and gold and carpets, are displayed with such garish opulence that they could be considered traveling palaces. Despite these displays of borrowed civilization, they know nothing of the more sophisticated ways of life. They do not even know how to build a bridge across a river. Rather, they prefer to pile their possessions on top of their horses and swim across them, holding onto their tails. They live still at the level of the hunter-gatherers, like our distant ancestors. Indeed, the hunt forms a major part of Hung existence. At the lowest level, it provides them their food and sustenance in the form of game. At its highest, it is a challenge to their champions and heroes to venture north into the desolate mountains and hillsides of the wastelands, and there prove their worth to their gods by bringing down fierce mutated creatures and ferocious spawn. They train animals in this as well. Their hunting dogs are so bestial and bloodthirsty that they even follow their masters into battle, and some tribes also train warbirds such as eagles and hawks. Their mounts are ponies, short and stocky, with a dense coat that allows them to endure the wasteland winter. Despite their size, they are capable of traveling great distances, sometimes as much as 100 leagues in 3 days. Their ponies graze as they travel, rooting beneath the snow for mosses and grass. The Hung have been known to feed their ponies flesh to promote their fighting spirit, giving them a bitter and truculent temper, much like their riders. The Hung themselves have no pride in what they consume, for they will eat game and fish when times are good, but when times are hard, they have no compunction in digging for roots from the ground or in snaring rats and other rodents for meat. Stories tell of them even ingesting lice, the afterbirth of a mare's falling, human flesh, and sucking the blood from their own horses where no other source of sustenance can be found. This abhorrent behavior is compounded by the filthy conditions in which they live, for they refuse to wash their bodies or their clothes or bury their refuse. for they believe it will anger their gods. Both men and women do mutilate themselves in order that they may present a more fearsome or lovely visage. The steppe is hardly more hospitable than the desert that borders it. In winter it freezes, and in the summer it bakes. And no matter what's the season, mountain and steppe alike are swept by winds so strong, it was said that they could nearly blow a rider off his horse. Year-round storms lashed the thin earth as the gods vent their ruthlessness upon the blasted ground. Truly this land and all that come from it are damned. As all other tribes, the country that surrounds them forms the Hung's perception of their deceitful gods. Rather than ascribing them animal totems or bastardized personas, their bare land impresses upon them the base worship of the elements. Thus they praise the god of blood and war through devastating lightning and fire, while the lord of decay is reverenced through mucky earth and so on. Thus, they have little need for shrine or temples, though they still construct monoliths to honor the dead, and invoke their blasphemy through ruinous icons that they carry. They keep these icons within their tents, and they pay austere worship during meals by rubbing meat and broth over their mouths in a hideous feeding ritual. Priests and shamans hold positions of great influence among them. They claim to be able to commune with the gods and relay their messages to their leaders, as well as seeing into the world of the dead, where according to them, the lives of the Hung are very similar to that of this world. How absolutely depressing. Let's continue. The ultimate belief of all Hung is that they have been sent to conquer the world for their dark masters, and they fight as though victory and domination is their birthright. Here is an excerpt from an introduction to the history of the Druki by Furion of Clarund that demonstrates this point. When our ancestors first made fall into our land of exile, they found it nigh deserted. A few pitiful natives had since inhabited the land after the Witch King had cleared them last, less than 100 years before, but they were a little challenge for our majestic dark riders and potent sorceries. We had arrived in the summer, though we could scarce recognize it in the frozen tundra of the land we named Nagoroth. Our first few months were easy as we quickly spread inland, founding settlement after settlement, wielding our magic to carve our towers and altars, free to worship in this hard country of promise. We also built defensive traps along the coast and to the south, ready for the pursuit by the false Phoenix King and his minions. As the first winter drew in, we began to suffer. Our buildings, designed in the manner fit for the balmy climates of Ulthuan, did nothing to protect us from the biting winds and chilling temperatures that we now faced. We have not yet learnt the means to subsist here. Food and resources were limited, and the Black Arks became trapped as their safe harbours froze over. For our noble Witch King, it promised an ignoble end to his glorious liberation, and then, as though to complete our misery, the Hung returned. The Hung travelled from far in the north, petty hunters following their prey down into the winter fields. They were feral savages on stunted ponies, and there was a horde of them. Thus, in the first encounters, our mighty people, beaten, hungry, and spread far across the land, were isolated and forced from their homes by this irascible barbarian host. Those who stood steadfast in defending what was theirs were slain and dismembered. Some were even eaten. Such was the bestial nature of our foe. Even our fine warriors, on those few occasions when we brought the fight to them in battle, fared badly. Our war steeds slipped and froze out in the broken icy terrain. Our guard was outflanked and surrounded in the narrow valleys, and the land which seemed to despise us as much as the Hung provided nothing to forage, while its harsh splintered wood proved useless to replace our elegant bows and sure arrows. With no way to replace our forces and precious few reserves to call upon, we retreated before the roving Hung bands, whose pursuit slowed as they pillaged and burnt the abandoned settlements, and gorged on the fine food and wine that had been left behind. Thus it was that our fledgling empire stood upon the brink of destruction by this pack of low savages, as all was laid to waste except for the Black Arks and the seat of the Witch King himself. That ark which had been breached, and around which the majestic city of Nagaron that had already begun to form. The Black Arks were frozen in place, but there were still formidable big fortresses, far greater than these cowardly mongrel packs would ever beheld. Nevertheless, they were too small to sustain themselves through an extended siege, and their supplies had been depleted in their long voyage and the doomed expansion inland, but there was no choice, they had to be defended. Beyond our walls, the Hung massed band after band of them gathered until it seemed the coasts and cliffs were alive with them. For an entire day they stood there on their foul, shrunken horses, regarding us through their tiny eyes, and I felt the fate of our tiny nation in the balance. And then, for no apparent reason, they turned and departed. Some of us say that our forces were too impressive, too formidable for them to wish to throw themselves against. Others say they considered that we would never survive on these shores and that they might as well let the land accomplish their task for them. I believe neither explanation. I believe in Malekith and praise him for whatever he must have done to secure our survival. The year after they returned again, but this time we met them with crossbows and war engines and beasts that we tamed from the forest and magics we conjured from the air. We fought and we repelled them, enslaving those we could as prisoners, to ever quicken our development and domination over this world. The next year and the year after, and many years since then, have we tested and broken these degenerate barbarians, even as they devised new methods by which to conquer. The tone for all our history with them was thus set as a constant competition, occasioned by infrequent alliances and more frequent betrayal and deceit, which will continue until we can finally eradicate them from our borders and from our heartlands. So this is why I thought this race to be quite interesting, considering the fact that they had almost taken over and destroyed the Dark Elves before the Dark Elves could even become a proper nation, and I think that that is actually quite important to know. My explanation for them leaving is they simply got bored, and they decided to go somewhere else, or maybe they felt the call of an Everchosen and were traveling back, considering that they'd have to travel all through the Northern Waste down to, Grand Cafe, around those areas. They're constantly moving, they're never staying there. The winter might have started subsiding, and they decided, yeah, let's just leave. But again, you can see that there is quite a lot happening with other tribes that we don't really get to hear too much about. Now, we've spoken a lot about the Hung and the Kurgans. They are actually quite a large threat, as you can see, and we don't really see too much about them when it comes to lore, other than a few books here and there. The Kurgans more than anything. And we don't really see miniatures, which is a massive shame. Hopefully Warhammer the Old World would fix that. But did you know that there was actually another chaotic faction which the Kurgans and the Hung feared? These are the Tong, and there's not too much lore about them, so let's discuss what we do know, and then we'll go into some speculation. Even among the fearsome Kurgan, there are still some names of infamy that strike terror into their hearts. The Tong is one such name. According to the tales of the Kurgan, they emerged from the west centuries ago and carved a bloody path through the tribes who opposed them. They fought with such a lack of regard for their own safety that they overwhelmed even the most reckless tribesmen. Rumors abounded that these were demons in human form. Just as the Kurgans reeled from this onslaught, the Tong, as quickly as they had appeared, vanished from their relatively verdant lands of the eastern steppes. Nothing more was heard from them, and the Kurgan tribes, untouched by their passage, fell upon their bloodied fellows in a series of raids and battles. A century or more passed before the Tong were heard from again. It was a great incursion of chaos that went unnoticed by the records of the Empire, the Dwarfs, and even those in far-off Cathay, for it never crossed the mountains of the world's edge, but instead laid waste to many of the wandering tribes of men's, orcs, goblins, and other races that dwell in those dark lands. None recall the name of the champion who led it, but it is remembered that as the greater horde approached, it was the banners of the Tong that were at the fore of it. Some tribesmen had heard stories of the deprivations of the Tong and fled before them. Others had not, and instead rode to join them, only to be cut down like wheat as they offered their hands. For years, the horde marched across the steppe. They sought out the most fearsome warrior tribes, and then killed them to a man, and after 5 years had passed, there was not a tribe in those lands that had not been vanquished or had not fled before them. The Tong travelled unchallenged back into the north, and never to return again as a whole tribe, but only as warbands and groups that followed the incursions of other champions. As one of the tribes closest to the pulsing heart of chaos, the Tong peoples are one of the most mutated and hideous of the northern tribes, and one of their most indomitable fighters. As the darkness of the north begins to swell, they are the first to join the ranks of the mighty incursions, and remain its central core of fierce mortal warriors. Now, we've seen some Tong in reference when the Great War against Chaos happened, as they did join against Asavar Kor, but one thing that actually makes me think that these might be a little bit more well known than we think is that we do have a lot of mutated type of warriors, the Skull Reapers and the Wrathmongers from the Scaramore tribe, which means that the Tong aren't a tribe but rather a culture. The Scaramore are found in the Northern Chaos Wastes, as close to the actual warping powers as possible, and they're very heavily mutated, so it's very possible that the Scaramore, the Wrathmonger, Scar Bloodwrath, they are themselves a collection of Tong warriors under the Scaramore name. This could also be linked up to the Putrid Blight Kings, but we know that most of them are just like very powerful champions, but they could have hailed mostly from the north. We could have a untapped market of very bestial human, demonic humans up there in the north that we just haven't seen yet in lore or in the tabletop or anywhere for that matter. And I kind of link this to the Tong. It just kind of makes a lot of sense. I always thought of it that way. When they were introduced in the end times, the Scaramore were like, oh yeah, we're from the north. Even normal Chaos Warriors can't really survive here. I was like, yeah, these are pretty much just the Tong with a different name. And I feel like that's generally what it is. Either way, it's actually kind of interesting to hear of demonic warriors, in a sense, or mutated warriors, which even other Chaos tribes do fear, because I feel like that is something which makes the evil factions feel a bit more relatable. They still feel fear, right? They have fear. And to end the video, we're going to talk about a faction that we've already talked about in a previous video, but I feel like they really don't get represented in lore as much, which is a massive shame. These are the Beast Fiends, and they're an offshoot of the Beastmen. You see, in the Southern Chaos Wastes, there lies a lot of Beastmen. There's not a lot of humans there. And the Chaos Gods actually do grant these Chaos Beasts some boons, which is actually really funny, considering that the ones actually getting stuff done, those in the Old World, those in Lustria and stuff like that, don't really get that much attention, as the Chaos Gods focus more on the humans. But in the Southern Territories, this is where we can find them, in the Southern Wastes, where they can't really travel to us because they don't use boats and stuff, and it's actually kind of funny. But we have demonically blessed beastmen, very different to the ones that we already know, as the ones we know are blessed, yes, you know, chaotic powers and so on, but these are more demonic than they are beastmen. This is why we call them beast fiends, the same thing as we call the Scaramore demon kin, because they're in that point where they're getting very, very close to ascending to demonhood. Unlike most of the beastmen tribes that we have seen in the old world, these beastmen tribes do focus on certain gods, so we do see tribes blessed by Khorne, tribes blessed by Nurgle, Slaanesh, or Tzeentch. I don't know if there's too many undivided tribes there, but the grand majority seems to be focused around one specific patron deity. Now, that's not to say that Beast Fiends don't happen in the known world. For example, we know of Khorngors, Pestigors, Slangors, and Zangors, and obviously Taurox the Brass Bull, which we can heavily link to Khorne, though the lore does suggest that he is more linked to Chaos Undivided. Morga the Shadowgave could be considered a Beast Fiend, but, you know, this is small concentrations. Tribes within the old world and so on will not have a lot of them, as they would be considered quite rare. Yet, when it comes to the South Wastes, we could apparently see loads of them. Like, the grand majority of the tribes will be Beast Fiends. Hell, we even know that they have access to special types of mounts that we haven't seen before, like mutated Rhinoxen. God knows what they look like, we know the standard ones, but could you imagine one tainted by chaos? And we know of different ones that are named, like Prince Ograx and so on, which more or less became human after they passed through the Chaos Gates, but they were demonic, they were brass, you know. This is the thing. It's a faction of beastmen that we've yet to properly see, and it would be really interesting if we could actually see proper beast fiends, marked by the gods in a stronger sense. And I don't know, like, it's always made me really curious, because we know it's there. I know a lot of people use it as the whole reference to Chaos Penguins in the South, which you never know could actually be a thing, but the idea of demonically blessed gores, bestigores, ungores, razorgores, anything that could live in that area, because it's very inhospitable. Like, it would probably be safer for these beast fiends to somehow figure out how to make a boat and leave than stay in the Southern Wastes. We know that the Southern Chaos Wastes are even dangerous to Chaos Warriors. Hell, Archaon even noted that that area was damned. But yeah, I don't know. It's just really weird that we haven't really seen too much about them. It's a shame that there's not too much lore. There's so little here. However, with all that being said, these are a perfect example that Chaos is actually very, very large in terms of its sway and different cultures, different peoples, different aspects, different warfare. It's a massive shame that we never really got too much of that in the past. Now, I'm still hoping that we will get, like, for example, when it comes to Warhammer 3, you know, Tribes of the North and just having different sub-factions, which would be absolutely phenomenal. Or, you know, in Warhammer the Old World, finally getting units to be Tong, Kurgan, you know, Hung. Now that Warhammer Fantasy is more popular than it ever was, it would be really, really cool to see this. We'll have to wait and see, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. Let me know which of these tribes you would actually join up with if you were given the chance, because, come on, I know a lot of you follow Chaos, right? Anyways, with all that being said, have a nice day, and I shall see you all again very, very soon.